Hello, everybody. So, before I begin the video, or the opening spiel today before the Q&As, I just want to make sure everyone is once more aware that I am running a poll. I have linked it in the live stream description. So if you have not participated in the Canadian federal politics poll, and BC, and Quebec, and Nova Scotia, and Newfoundland provincial, by all means go and fill it out. I have good samples for Quebec, BC, and Nova Scotia. Newfoundland still on the small side, might not be usable, but we'll see what I can do. I might publish anyways, because no one else is publishing, and a small, borderline, non-scientific sample. And it's non-scientific because the sample's too small, so I guess a better way to phrase this is borderline, statistically insignificant sample might be the best we got, but we're going to work on it anyways. But let us begin here on my main spiel of the day. And is it this screen? Aha, here we go. So, if those of you who have been with my channel for a while, none of you, or very few of you are probably in chat right now, know that in March 2022, I made a video about how the West is learning the wrong lessons in Ukraine. Now, in my last video, or one of my last videos, I asked people if they were interested in me discussing geopolitics a bit, and people were generally supportive, so we're going to try this out here. If people do not like this and would prefer my regular content, by all means, comment in the chat or in the description, or sorry, in the comments after this live stream is VOD. But let's discuss here. So let's start off first with the disclaimers. Do not interpret this as being pro-war in any way, shape, or form. Do not interpret this as being pro or anti any side. It doesn't particularly matter. This is purely objective analysis on what I'm discussing here. So what I'm about to discuss here is in relation to specifically the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Now, the actual invasion and the legalities and the morality and all that stuff, that's a whole other question. Doesn't matter for this video. What matters here is the actual particularities of invading a country. Because I see a lot of people in the West under this perception that Russia's losing the war, or that Russia not being able to have defeated Ukraine by now is pathetic or bad, or we should not consider Russia a serious country because they haven't been able to defeat Ukraine right now. And this to me is just absurd. It's a complete ignorance of what actual warfare between relatively similar countries looks like. Let's be clear. At the outset of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, Ukraine had the strongest army other than Russia in Europe. They had the largest army other than Russia in Europe. Ukraine was very quick and very willing to deploy mass conscription. NATO, despite various slow rolling and peculiarities in supply, has supplied Ukraine with billions of dollars of surplus military equipment. Most of it is not brand new kit. Most of it is tier 2 or tier 3 kit, though some new kit has been provided. All this to mean that, for all intents and purposes, Ukraine and Russia are as close to two peer countries fighting a war as we have had in probably since World War II. Maybe you could say Korea, but it's really hard to say if China and Communist China and the Korean War is the peer to the US-led coalition, or if the US-led coalition had just kind of given up. It's not really clear. I think you can argue either way on that perspective. But in the end, it's very, very clear that Russia and Ukraine are roughly peer militaries. Now, what this means is that in a peer-on-peer struggle, there is going to be back and forth. There's going to be moments where, as you see on this ISW map, that at one point Russia occupied much, much more of Ukraine, and then it was pushed back, and now slowly Russia is retaking a lot of this ground. If you looked at this, if you follow this relatively recently, or over the last year, they've gained about this much territory that I'm carving out here. Like this front line here that I'm tracing with my cursor, this was occupied with about the last calendar year. Now, this seems pretty slow, but the reason why things like this are slow is, again, these are pure militaries. Once we had the advent of trenches and the advent of what's the word for it? Oh, sorry about steam popping up there. Once we invented modern breech-loading rifles, breech-loading artillery, frankly, even just rifled artillery and rifles, you get this kind of grueling attritional war. Now, there's lots of different strategies and tactics you can use, and there's a lot of different doctrinal styles your military can be set up to do, but inevitably, all war is essentially attritional. That means you're not likely going to get big, massive breakthroughs. You're not likely going to have coup de grace hits unless you completely overmatch your enemy or you completely catch them off guard. If we look at World War II, we look at the Battle of France, the quintessential quote-unquote blitzkrieg campaign. Now, the Nazis in World War II were running on a shock and awe style military. In other words, their goal was to try to hit you really hard, really fast, and overrun you. Now, a lot of people colloquially refer to this as blitzkrieg, but shock and awe is probably a better term to describe it. The U.S. military also operates on shock and awe doctrines, to be clear, these days, in modern 2025. Though sometimes they switch into superior firepower, but I'm not using superior firepower as like the Hearts of Iron 4 term, though the Hearts of Iron 4 term is informed off real military doctrine. Basically, the idea being you just overwhelm the enemy with fire and you defeat them that way, versus shock and awe, you're overrunning them. But these are not the same creatures. But to go back to my point here, the Battle of France, while being the quintessential blitzkrieg, is the perfect example of a lot of these things require a proper quote-unquote blitzkrieg requires the enemy to be completely ignorant of the action at hand. In other words, the French military was incapable of reacting to the Nazi push through the Ardennes. They had the reserves. They had the military forces, but the command and control was not capable of reacting to it until the whole situation had imploded. That's not very replicable. You look at another example, the early days of Operation Barbarossa. The Russians were caught with complete strategic surprise. Their army was not ready to defend. It was not in a position to defend. It had no positions really prepared to defend the frontier. And the Nazis and their allies attacked with superior numbers to the deployed troops on the Russian frontier in 1941. And this did cause a complete collapse of the Russian front because they were not prepared, they were not ready, they were not organized. But then they managed to stabilize, reposition, and then the Eastern Front turns into a grinding attritional war. You see cases like Case Blue, or the various Soviet counterattacks, and I'm forgetting all the names of the operations off of, but like Operation Mercury, I believe, was their Stalingrad counteroffensive, where you see lots of ground change, but that's more of an artifact of the Eastern Front in 1942, 1943, 1944, not having enough troop density for the technology to stagnate. Because that's the key thing. You need a certain amount of troop density per technology to stagnate a front, to turn it into a grinding attritional affair. Now, you can try to overwhelm this by having just so much more firepower or so much more mobility than the enemy that they can't stop you or being able to defeat their attack. So, like, hypothetically, if the Russians had tanks and like BMP like advanced that could stop all the ATGMs and stop all the drones, then they could probably blitzkrieg Ukraine. But obviously they don't have that. I don't think anyone in the world has that. Now, what we see in modern day, and this is really where drones come in, is they actually allow drones and modern guided or very accurate guided, in many cases, artillery pieces allow a very diffuse screen of infantry to hold a front to the same level of cohesion that a much larger formation had to 100 years ago. So you look at actual infantry combat that happens in Ukraine, the actual footage that people have recorded of it. It's almost always a fire team versus, at best, another fire team. You might have 2 fire teams attacking with 1 fire team defending, but sometimes it might be 1 dude left and like 4 guys attacking. And this, because there's attacks and counterattacks, this is Ukrainian and Russian on either side that's happening. This really shows that this front is very thin and very diffuse. There's not a lot of people on the front line, and that's part of this is Russia doesn't want to conscript enough people to actually have the density. They don't want to conscript anyone. Actually, they're trying very, very hard to only use volunteers to keep up the support for the war. But this does lead to complications. This does lead to difficulties. There isn't really the capacity in a war like this for either side to really meaningfully use a lot of tactics, a lot of doctrinal strategies. The Ukrainians and the Russians in 2025 no longer have the armor or mechanized reserves. They don't have the airplane reserves. They don't have the helicopter reserves to actually carry out and succeed with shock and awe tactics. Maybe they're either Ukraine or Russia is hiding a reserve and they're going to have like a really big all-out push at some point. But as we have seen, witnessed on front line and based on loss rates that we can see confirmed, neither side has this reserve. So what you are left with, since no one can actually carry out shock and awe tactics, is you're really left with one of the other doctrinal strategies you can use, which is superior firepower or infiltration attacks. And those are really the 3 core things that modern militaries are built around. Either you're going to blow the crap out of the enemy and hope that you just blow them up fast and they blow you up. You're either going to try to overrun them really fast, really brutally, really overwhelmingly, so that they can't react, or you are going to try to overrun them without them noticing, which is what infiltration attacks are. Now, Russia is running infiltration attacks. That's basically their entire doctrine right now. You look at this part of the offensive here. This whole offensive up here has been conducted by infiltration attacks. This whole area was taken solely by infiltration tactics, and it's the easiest example of the infiltration tactics being used, but it's all across the front. That's the main Russian strategy. And this is, I think, where we start seeing a lot of the disconnect in the West. And I think the issue that I've been observing a lot of commentators say, especially those who don't really have any background or knowledge in military systems, and I won't describe what my background is, but suffice it to say, I do know some things. People mistake very, very commonly this idea that there isn't grand offensives with one or other army is bad. So in other words, they're like, the Russian army's bad because it can't blitzkrieg Ukraine like the US did in 1991 with Iraq, or even 2003 in Iraq. But that's a bad example because Iraq was vastly inferior to the US coalition. And the Iraqis didn't really have enough foreign support or foreign backers to replenish forces, and their army just wasn't very good to begin with. The Ukrainian and Russian armies were very comparable to begin with, and both have been able to resupply losses quite heavily because of either domestic or foreign support. And so what I've observed really is this kind of hubristic idea that if the situations were reversed, and for some reason, like, we were invading Ukraine, we being NATO, was invading Ukraine through, like, Poland and, like, Romania or whatever, that we would have steamrolled Ukraine, and Ukraine would have collapsed, and the fact that Russia can't do that means Russia's an impotent threat, or they're not a real threat. Oh, they couldn't defeat Ukraine, they're weak. But it's just... it's such a hubristic and wrong interpretation of modern war. Modern war is not fast. In fact, you could say for the most of history, war hasn't been fast. Fast wars are basically the anomaly. World War II is essentially an anomalous war. The fact that there was so much mobility on the front line in so many theaters is just a fluke. It shouldn't have been that way with the technology at the time. It really was just the case that, like, why did France fall so quickly once the Allies got out of Normandy? The Germans didn't have enough troops once they lost all the, like, 200,000 men in the Valais pocket or whatever it was. They just did not have the troop density anymore. And the Allies could keep bringing in more troops, and they couldn't replace losses fast enough. But you look at a front like Italy, where the Germans could replace losses fast enough, and it's a grinding attritional slog up the Italian peninsula, where the vastly superior Allied militaries were slowly attritioning and pushing back the vastly inferior German army in Italy. Fewer men, fewer equipment, very little support. They didn't have air supremacy. Vastly inferior. On the Eastern Front, the generally speaking, superior Russian army took forever to push back the Germans by 1944 because the Germans... Sorry about that, the fire truck just drove by. I hope you guys didn't hear that. I hope that fire truck's going somewhere that's not actually a serious fire, but well, keep your prayers out for that. But what was I saying? The Russian advance was stymied because the Germans were putting all of their reinforcements against the Russians, and it's really until Bagration when the German army is just completely crushed that they can't replace anything. And you go from, like, 1942, the end of the Stalingrad, or early 1943, the end of the Stalingrad campaign, to Bagration. There's very little serious front movement. And then Operation Bagration happens, and the entire German army collapses, and then they just rout for the rest of the war. Because they can no longer replace losses. And that still happened in places like World War I, or the Korean War. In the World War I, what happened? Well, the Germans and the French and the British were on the Western Front, and they were fighting each other, trading trench for 3 years. Then, 4 years really. Then the Russians leave the war, and the Germans try to do one last attack with all the reserves they pulled from Russia, and they failed. Then the U.S. comes with millions of men, and the Germans are now exhausted from their attack, and they push back, and the German army crumbles. And that's why you get the surrender in November 11th, 1918. The Germans did not surrender because Germany was occupied. They surrendered because they could no longer replace losses or stop the... Sorry about that. They could no longer replace losses, and they could not stop the Allies from advancing, so they just folded. They gave up. Now, is that going to happen in Ukraine here? I don't know. I really could not tell you if Ukraine or Russia is going to fold first. But what I can tell you is the progression of this war is... At the current moment, Russia is going to keep slowly advancing until either the Russian army/economy implodes and they can no longer replace losses, and then they will collapse really fast, or the Ukrainians will no longer be able to replace losses and equipment fast enough, and they will collapse. Now, given everything I can see, I would wager it's Ukraine that is more likely going to fold first, because Ukraine just has fewer people. But that's not certain, not guaranteed. But it's much less likely that we're just going to see, if nothing changes substantially, that we're going to see Russia lose. It's just this bizarre idea that we've kind of psyoped ourselves into in the West that, oh, they haven't defeated the Ukrainians really, really quickly, therefore they can no longer defeat the Ukrainians. A similar example to this is I've seen time and again is people, this is before even the Russia-Ukraine war happened, that we had the Finnish Winter War, 1939-1940. A lot of people are under the impression that Finland won that war. Finland lost. Finland lost the war. Now, Finland wasn't annexed. They didn't set up a Soviet puppet government in Finland. But Finland still lost the entirety of Vyborg and some other territories that no one really cares or knows about. I don't think really anyone lived in those territories, but in the Winter War. They lost even more land in the Continuation War when they lost that, but that's another story altogether. And I think people did live in the Continuation War territories, but I digress. But Finland lost those territories. And I think we're in a situation like this with a lot of these conflicts going around. The odds are that no matter what the outcome is, the Russians are going to keep some of these territories at the way things are going. That just seems to be the inevitable conclusion, because I don't think the West is going to do anything. The only way you would change this outcome is if the West actually sent men to the front line. But I don't think the West will ever do that, regardless of whether that's a good or bad idea. And let's be clear, if the West did send troops on the front line, that will be World War III. That's what that will be. That is what that is. But I don't think they will do that because the West doesn't really have the stomach to do this. The West doesn't really have the stomach to keep supplying Ukraine as is. There's been a lot of difficulties to keep getting Ukraine supplied by NATO allies. And NATO, despite having had 3 years to do something about these military production problems that they have, they really haven't kicked up military production in a substantial or consequential fashion. Now, does that mean they can't do that? No, of course they could, but they just haven't yet. So, what is all this to say here? Well, modern war is slow. War between peer countries is going to be slow. It's always going to be a brutal, attritional war, and millions of people are going to die. If China invades Taiwan, unless Taiwan immediately folds, millions of people are going to die. If the Korean War reignites, millions of people are going to die, regardless of whether nukes are used. There's no, oh, we can just overwhelm our peer competitor and just crush them in like 1 or 2 battles. The ability to defeat the enemy in 1 or 2 battles, like Napoleon did in the Third Coalition, being able to defeat the Third Coalition effectively through the Bavaria campaign and the Battle of... I can't believe I forgot the name of the battle. Austerlitz. The Battle of Austerlitz and the Bavaria campaign basically defeated the entirety of the Third Coalition. That's not going to happen in modern day. There's not a situation where a modern war is going to be decided by a few battles. And even in Napoleon's time, that was even on its dying legs. You look at the 1812 campaign into Russia, you have battles like Borodino that are on the same scale as Austerlitz, and it doesn't matter. The outcome of Borodino had no impact on the war. Napoleon won the battle, but it didn't do anything for him. It didn't matter. And if you go even further back, you go look at, say, the Second Punic War, everyone's favorite war to discuss in these things. Rome loses 3 huge battles in Italy. They also lose a pretty big battle in Spain. But it doesn't really matter. Because if both sides are roughly peer matched, but one side doesn't want to give up, then there's nothing that can really happen there. So, That's kind of the gist, right? Like, you're not really ever going to see this kind of fast war anymore. It just doesn't exist. There is no such thing as a fast, quick war. And anyone who's trying to pitch you on the idea that someone is losing a war or is pathetic or doing bad in a war because they didn't win it in like 3 days, a month, a year, 2 years, that's silly. There is no capacity to have a war end that quickly unless one power just completely overwhelms the other power to the point where they're not even remotely comparable, like Iraq in 2003 versus the US-led coalition. The US-led coalition is just so overwhelmingly more powerful, it's not comparable. It'd be the equivalent of like a World War I army fighting a Napoleonic army, like that level of tech gap. The US could completely dominate the air, even with Iraqi SAM systems and Iraqi fighters. Didn't matter, they could completely overrun them. They could attack Iraq from many different directions. They could airlift troops behind Iraqi lines whenever they wanted. They had complete air supremacy. They had complete armor supremacy. Their armor was better than the Iraqi armor in every way, shape, or form. The Iraqis really had no weapons to take out Abrams on a reliable or long-range basis. And the Iraqis didn't have the ability to recover losses. And that's really the big kick. If Iraq somehow had the capacity to replace T-72s like hotcakes, yeah, actually the war could have been a long, grinding, attritional fight still. It probably would have seen way more Iraqis die than Americans, but it probably would have been a long, grinding war. But as it is, Iraq couldn't replace T-72s like hotcakes. The only weapons they could really produce in vast, vast quantities, or at least acquire in vast, vast quantities, things like AK-47s or other AK variants, and like RPGs and other RPG kind of stuff, like those kind of small arms. And that's great if you want to have light infantry insurgencies, but it doesn't defeat the U.S. military. But that's kind of the gist here, right? So you're not going to see a fast war. Fast wars don't exist. The only reason a fast war would happen is if you completely and utterly can crush the enemy in a month, and that almost never happens, and that really can only happen against an enemy that's so inferior that to call it a war is dishonest. It's more of a conquest, unopposed. But with that, let me touch on Q&As. So, I actually have a good number of Q&As, but by all means, answer more in the chat here. I'll start off with one that is in the chat. We have one from Ronnie BBY. Would a digital ID be mass adopted in Canada if proposed? Is it likely a conservative may introduce it even when they usually are outspoken against it? If the government were to introduce a digital ID and they would actually enforce that law and they have the buy-in of the security apparatus to do it, it would be adopted. There is really no mechanism that you would see mass resistance against something like that if the security apparatus supports it. And when I say that, I mean like the RCMP, your local city police, the government, or not the government, like things like CSIS or like the CSE. If all of those entities want a digital ID, or at least will enforce a digital ID, it's going to happen and you can't do anything about it. We saw this in COVID with the COVID vaccine passports. There was nothing the average person could meaningfully do to stop it. Some people could defraud it, but that's about it. Next question I have here. Let's see. Okay, we have this question from Alt Zigbee. Just a question about samples for the survey you conducted. Considering that it is on an English video, does that skew the results for the Quebec election survey? So, that's a good question. The short answer is no, because I have a pretty robust methodology to begin with. But second, I actually have on my mailing list and through other abilities like making a video about Quebec itself, which is what I did, I actually have the ability to gather a lot of francophones. For various reasons, there's actually quite a lot of Quebecers who watch my channel on a regular basis, and they like my content, and a lot of them are French. So I can usually get a pretty decent sample of Quebecers if I want to, and I do all the things I need to do. But we'll see. I have another question here from... so it doesn't really skew the results normally, unless I really, really screw up myself. Another question here from chat. I have John Cornelius Magnus. My pronunciations are awful. What is the best bagel? So it depends a little bit. I would say normally the everything bagel would be my favorite bagel. That's what I would go with. Our next question here. I'll get back to this one in a second here. So we have Frapp Harden. Do you think Pierre will win his leadership review? And do you see a 2026 election? I think Poilievre will certainly win his leadership review at this point. The fact that he won the election in Battle River Crowfoot so firmly, there's really no path for him to lose the leadership race at this point. The only way that could happen is if his polls tank in December, but his polls are fine, and they're going up. He's on the upswing right now, so it's unlikely that we will see him just completely implode. Sorry about that, I need a drink. We have another one from Highway to Heaven 91. Will Kirk's assassination help the CPC win? I don't think it will have any quantifiable impact on the Conservative Party's electoral performance. It might have some ramifications in the long run. There has been some inklings that perhaps like church attendance has popped up recently, but I don't really know, and we haven't seen it in a long enough fashion to see if that will be a sustained thing or if that is just like a one-off little surge. I don't really know. But to the core report in question, I don't think this will have any basis on the Conservative Party winning at all, regardless of whether you like Charlie Kirk or not. Another question here from JSK010. Interesting video. Question. What are social issues in the Quebec context? Language and French identity, I assume, not trans stuff like in Western Canada, right? So, generally speaking, the most important one is French / the Quebecois cultural identity. And that does include things like supporting and defending laicity. Those are the biggest three in Quebec. But it's not correct to say that the Quebecois social issue, like that quote-unquote woke stuff, is not on the radar of social issues in Quebec. Just recently, the CAQ government announced they're not going to have... They're going to ban the use of non-binary pronouns or whatever. I can't think of the exact way they phrase it on government documents. Basically, they're going to force everything to use male or female gender on government documents. So it's not right to say that like the trans, like woke kind of stuff is not a factor in Quebec. It's not a thing people care. Like, it's certainly a thing people care about, but it's not the top three. And from what my read is, most people in Quebec care about it insofar as it undermines French quite heavily. There's other concerns too. I think a lot of the concerns that the Albertan Conservatives have are shared by a good segment of people in Quebec. Nationally, that's a true statement. But specifically, it's a lot of it is about for the French language. Most things come down to defending French language because language and culture are very intertwined. If Quebec loses the French language, it's going to lose its culture, to the most part. Like, yes, the Maritimes in the prairies in Ontario and Newfoundland have different cultures. That is a true statement. But they are much closer than they are to the Quebecois. And that's because of French. Another question from chat here. Are you familiar with Hearts of Iron 4? If we were to somehow transplant World Tension mechanic into the real world, what percentage of world tension would you say we are at right now? I would say I am familiar with Hearts of Iron 4. I have many hundreds of hours. I think I have over 1,000 hours in the game. I would say I'm also pretty good at the game. I don't say it if I do say so myself. I would say probably like 40-50% kind of thing. Maybe a little lower than 50%. Like the quote-unquote neutral countries probably can't quite declare war yet. But between Ukraine and the Israel-Palestine stuff, we are very, very close to opening the door to just generalized wars of conquest. It's very close. So, like, we're in, like, probably, like, I'd say 40%. Probably 40%. Okay, I also have a super thanks here from Mark Perusa 1. I should have prioritized this one. I forgot. Sorry about that. How do you think voters who switch from Poilievre to Carney will perceive a growing debt and the prospects of austerity measures? For example, if I were a 55-plus homeowner in the GTA with a 1 million-plus property, would these issues be significant enough to make me consider switching parties again? So this is a good question. Now, there's two parts to it. One, the growing debt. I don't think the debt in itself will move voters. The debt will move voters if we hit the point where no one will lend us money anymore. But right now, we do not seem to have crossed that threshold. So until we are below the threshold, then no one wants to lend us money, which is called default. And by the way, many people think that we can borrow infinitely. That is wrong. And many people think we can borrow as much as, say, like the German or the US can. That's also wrong. We cannot borrow as much as them. How much we can borrow, we don't know. No one knows. This is not like Victoria 3. There's not a credit limit you can just look at and be like, aha, that is my country's credit limit. No one knows how much Canada can borrow. But eventually, we will borrow enough money that investors will no longer want to buy our bonds. That day will happen if we do not fix the deficit. I don't know when it will be, and I don't know how much that money will be. But it is inevitable, because there's only so much people are willing to lend us money. Eventually, our debt will be like, too bad. Now, you can ward that off by increasing your bond yields, but even then, if the bond yields are almost the entire budget, like if paying back the debt, interest on the debt, is too high a share of the budget, people will just stop lending us money, regardless of what bond yields are. But to the other aspect, austerity measures could impact the 55-plus voter, but it's unlikely they will. Because cutting public sector employment doesn't affect them. They're retired. Increasing government efficiency won't matter to them, even if it saves money. Cutting random programs or stuff like the most recent announcement where they're going to limit Canada Post to only... They're going to stop all door-to-door delivery for Canada Post. That's not going to affect most people. Some people might get mad, but a lot of people are... I don't get door-to-door delivery for Canada Post. I have a P.O. box, or not a P.O. box, I have a Canada Post box I have to go to. So that's not going to change many people. The things that will really affect seniors would be if there is a change to pensions. But even then, that might not affect them depending on how the pension change is done. But it could affect them because they're dumb and they think it's going to affect them, and then they get mad. But, for example, like let's say Carney were to raise the retirement age. You probably would raise the retirement age so it's only people who are like 25 who would have the lower retirement age or something. Or maybe people who are 30 or 35 or whatever. It's very unlikely you would say to someone who's 60 that actually the retirement age is now 70. No one is going to do that. When Harper did it, when he raised it to 67, I believe you had to be under 40. Maybe it was under 30, I don't recall. But he reduced. There's a point that you would still have a 65 retirement age, and it was below that age, it would be 67. And it was many, many years before retirement. So the current 55 plus or 65 plus crowd who are retired probably won't be affected. So all this to say, I don't think the debt or austerity will affect the vote choice of the 55 plus demographic unless Carney decides to just screw up. If he's just dumb and he screws everything up, I guess it could happen. But without screwing everything up, it's not going to affect it. I did answer this question directly, but I thought afterwards that this would be an interesting question to do on the live stream. So this is from Neolithic Transit Revolution 427. Given what I see as an increasingly regional, western base of the Conservative Party and the repeated electoral failures to form government, do you think it's possible to see an alliance between the Reform base and Bloc base in a federal confederationalist party in the future? The short answer is yes. The long answer is the Conservative Party isn't pretty much just a western base. It's not just regional. It is, generally speaking, its base is resource production areas. For the most part, farming areas, rural areas, small towns, small cities. Some big cities like Quebec City or Edmonton or Calgary, and some suburbs like in Vancouver or Greater Toronto. That's where the base is. It is across the country, and it is growing in places like the Maritimes. Now, what we saw in 2025 is the Liberal base also grew in the Maritimes, so they ended up not gaining new seats. But the Conservatives did get the most votes they have ever gotten in Nova Scotia, for example, so their base did increase here. It's just the Liberals increased faster. Now, which one is more sustainable? Who's to say? But it's not just the party is only like Alberta, Saskatchewan. It is more national than that. It's at least as national as the Liberal Party is, if not more. Now, regarding to if it is going to form an electoral alliance, there will never be in Canada, with the way our electoral system works, and this is not first past the post, this is about how donations in election funding works, you will never see a formal alliance, because you need to run a candidate in every riding to get the most spending cap. And the spending cap is really low. The spending cap is like somewhere in the realm of like $120,000 per riding. So you only have roughly, no, is it $10,000 per riding? Whatever, I don't recall the exact numbers. But the spending cap is like $40 million if you run a full slate of candidates. $40 million is not a lot of money. You do not want to be hamstrung by not running candidates. That's why you'll find candidates who sign on in places like, for the Conservative Party, like Toronto Centre, who probably don't do anything, unless they're really eager. They very likely just exist there to give the Conservatives another $120,000 in cap, or whatever it is. They probably don't do anything, because they don't need to win, because no one expects them to win. They're only there to increase the party's spending cap. Another question here in chat from Jack Green. Did you see that the AfD has just recently topped every major poll in Germany, and Reform UK is on track for majority? What does the future of European politics look like? This is a good question. So the gist here is Europe, like much of the world, the political parties on average, much of the West I should say, are completely off-center when it comes to social policy. That's why I've been a very strong voice saying that social policy is more important these days, because almost every party is off-center. It's also why I continually say that things like median voter theory are wrong, because it does not describe how political parties act. It is an incorrect description of the world. Now, in places like Europe, Germany, the UK, France, Sweden, Netherlands, Italy, etc., most politicians are to the left of voters on social issues, and often to the far left of voters. The average German voter wants significant immigration cuts. Not like a very, very, very significant immigration cut. Possibly like near zero immigration in practice. The median German politician doesn't want that. They want to keep it or increase immigration. And as long as that disconnect exists, you're going to see parties like the AFD or Reform UK or whatever the current vehicle of the people who actually are at least theoretically promising to cut immigration is. That party will dominate. It doesn't matter if there's a cordon sanitaire in the long term. It's not going to matter if this is a first past the post or a proportional system. It's not going to matter if people call the leader of the party mean words. That's not going to matter. Because at the end of the day, voters in Germany, in France, in Italy, in Spain, in Britain, want massive cuts to immigration. They want to deport a lot of people who have come here illegally or fraudulently, which you could say is the same thing, but they're slightly different. And unless that is satisfied, you're going to see these parties grow. The media can say the AFD is like a Nazi party as much as it wants, or it's far right, or whatever their current scare word is. But that's not going to matter. And if you remember my last live stream a month ago, I touched on, if you continually say good thing, the thing you want is bad word, people will associate bad word with good thing. And then they will think, oh wait, bad word is good word. And then they'll think, oh, maybe I am bad word. And then they'll think of all the other things related to that, and then they will adopt that. So in other words, by falsely calling something like the AFD a Nazi party or fascistic, when it's really just an anti-immigration party, that's really what it is. There's some potentially there's some controversial figures in the AFD specifically, but the core reason why anyone votes for the AFD is not the controversial figures. No one is voting AFD because there's some like crackpot people in it. It's the same reason why in the US, very few people who vote for the Democratic Party are doing it because there's some crackpot far left people. Almost no one is doing it because those crackpot far left people. No one is voting for the AFD for the most part because of the crackpot people in it. They're voting for it because it's the only party that wants to cut immigration. And that stuff will continue. It will continue until the AFD gets power, fails to cut immigration, and then the next party will start the cycle again. Or we'll cut immigration, solve the problem, and then voters will go back to normal. Whatever normal is after that. Okay, I have some long questions here from Rocco. I will see how many of these I can get. Okay, so this is the first one. If the Liberals get unpopular by New Year, they know they can't win majority for a snap election in the spring. If we don't get a snap election and they remain in control of the government when trade meetings begin, does the Prime Minister need the House to pass a trade deal? Or they don't need the House to make an agreement with the US and Mexico. Thereby, I'm actually worried because I think Trump could secure a deal of the century with a weak Prime Minister. The general gist is Parliament does need to reapprove treaties. The Prime Minister cannot unilaterally sign a deal. It has to be confirmed by Parliament. In the current composition of Parliament we have right now, I suspect unless Carney signed a really stupid, like hilariously bad deal, he would get the votes to agree to it. So it's very likely that any deal he does get will be signed. Will be approved by Parliament. Unless it's really, 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 really bad. But it's unlikely we'll see that. Even if Carney was the weakest prime minister on trade in history, he only needs a few MPs to side with him. He has 169 seats. He only needs like 3 MPs to vote with him. Or 3 opposition MPs to be absent during voting days. Another question I have here from Rocco. Apparently I cannot scroll on this, so we'll open a new pane. You said others are suggesting there's a chance the Liberals will test their popularity by the new year and roll out left-wing policy to see if they can win a majority in the spring election of 2026. Right now, the polls suggest PM Carney and the Liberals could be very unpopular by then, maybe even sooner if they don't secure some wins. Carney and the Liberals managed to pass a budget in the spring. It could be a lifesaver. However, do you think Carney can even make it to the USMC joint review in fall 26? Given that many people who bought homes during COVID will see their mortgages come up for renewal in the summer. I don't see any reason why Carney won't survive the whole 4-year term, unless he calls it early himself. The NDP is broke. The NDP is currently in a leadership race. The NDP is going to need years to rebuild. I really don't see them willing to call a snap election. I don't think they will vote non-confidence for sure until at least 27 or 28. But even then, it's unlikely because I suspect the NDP is going to nominate a leader, elect a new leader who's going to be more concerned about Poilievre forming government than whatever Carney's doing. And now here I have this question will probably take up the rest of the video, but it's one I skipped over earlier because it's a very interesting question. Or I guess the stream, I should say. This is from DVX Balorum. Or is it Dukes Balorum? I'm going to go with Dukes Balorum. I agree that Quebec leaving would likely mean the dissolution of Canada. Ontario would become too dominant for the West. However, it'd be interesting to see a video on how this might play out. Do you see these provinces trying to join the US? Becoming independent nations? Creating a new confederation of sorts? So this is a great question. And I have an answer. Let me just get this up, because if I was smart, I would have had this ready already. But I didn't, because I don't always prepare. I do not always prepare. Huzzah! So, I made this a while ago. This is only a rough draft. This is not a proper thing, per se. But this is how this is also assuming the US implodes, but this is how I see the fault lines happening if Canada and also the US were to fall apart. So, I see I did not color that region, whatever. The gist here for Canada is Quebec, I fully expect if Canada were to implode, is going to try to gobble up the francophone parts of New Brunswick, Labrador, and the francophone parts of Ontario as a kind of greater Quebec. And they probably will succeed to do that because I don't think in the chaos of Canada collapsing there will be really significant resistance to them. And I think a lot of those regions will probably be at least passively accepting of it. I would also see the Maritimes, what's left of it, being one entity. I see I've colored the Madeline Islands as purple. They should be blue. I don't know why I did that wrong. Newfoundland, the island, would be its own thing because as much as Newfoundland and the Maritimes are similar, they're different. And I think Newfoundland, if it has the option of either being in poverty with the Maritimes or in poverty alone, is going to be in poverty alone. Ontario, if the U.S. implodes, I could see the rest of like the industrial part of like Southern Ontario joining the Midwest area. But if it doesn't, you would just see Ontario be this little rump state here, and it would not be very coherent or very happy. Then, for the most part, you'd probably see Northwest Ontario plus the prairies and most of rural BC be one entity together, and you'd have like the Lower Mainland and Vancouver Island be its own thing. It might join with the U.S. like Cascadian kind of forces as well. Because this breakdown here is roughly the main cultural groups that exist in Canada. And I've touched on this elsewhere. I don't think I have a good graphic for this. Let me see if I can find a graphic. Do I have this? Where is the graphic? I made it somewhere. I might not be able to find it. Just taking a look here. Yeah, I don't know where I put this. But somewhere, someday, I will share this graphic. Oh wait, I'm able to find it on Twitter. Give me a second here. Aha! Here we go. I can find it on Twitter. Success. So, this here is my taxonomy of the English, the Angloid, you call them. And if we scroll down here, we have the four groups that make up Anglo-Canada. We have the Maritimer, we have the Central Canadian, we have the Western Canadian, and we have the Newfie. And these are ethnically, culturally, and for some sense, linguistically, distinct groups of people. Now, they're very similar to each other. As you can see here, they come from this kind of Anglo-Canadian stock, which comes from the United Empire Loyalists and Scottish North Americans. But they are notably different. For example, the Maritimers are much more Scottish. The Newfies are much more Irish. The Western Canadians have the third wave immigration influx, which is mostly like Ukrainians and Germans, but there's some other groups in there. That's what the third wave means, by the way. So these groups are different. They're not the same. That's why I said earlier in the video that the stream that Western Canadians, Ontarians, Maritimers, Newfies, Quebecois, they're five different groups of people. You could even go so far as to say like Lower Mainland should be a different group. But it's hard to my read if the Lower Mainland is a distinct group of Anglo, or if the Anglos in that area are just a minority group now, because it's a very, very, very diverse area. When I say minority, I don't necessarily mean they're not the largest group, but they are not the majority group anymore, if that makes sense. They might be the plurality still, but I'm not 100% certain. So, politically, this area is very, very different to, say, like, Saskatchewan, Alberta, because it has a lot of Chinese and Sikhs and other groups that have migrated there since then. One day I might make a video about this, but for now I won't. Let me know in the comments or chat if you guys want more stuff like that, but we'll see. Just to finish off here, I'll just do a couple more questions here that are in the chat. We have from Iron Guy 1614. What do you think of a poll saying the Conservatives would have won with Kamala as president, and the other demographic data from the poll? I might break that down into its own video itself or part of another video at some point in the future. But the gist is, I'm not surprised that Kamala being president would have, at least in hindsight, made people vote less for the Liberals. Because if you look at that polling data, I don't have it offhand here, but it really shows that the NDP does a lot better if Kamala's president, and the Conservatives basically do the same. So it kind of shows that there was a lot of NDP to Liberal crossover vote because of Donald Trump. And that makes sense to me. The other demographic data, I'll probably talk about that more in a different video. I'll probably touch on that next month in the Canada video, which will probably be like the first video of October. And one final question from GLJ Rocco 97 in chat here. How's your wife and your baby? Well, my wife is annoyed because I parked behind her and she wanted to leave earlier, but I... oh, oops. I did it silly. But other than that, she's doing good. Little Leo's doing happy things. He's like, guys, I'm just telling you right this. You can't appreciate how much you're going to love your child until you have your child. It, like, the smiles, like when your kid smiles at you, when he giggles, or she giggles if I guess you had a girl, it's just like it's like the best feeling in the world. There's like, it's one of those things where it's like, part of me wishes I had kids earlier, but knowing that I have my current child, my current son, I wouldn't have changed anything because I really love my son. But I definitely recommend, if you are in a situation where you're married and all that stuff, like, just have a kid. You're not going to regret it. At least I've never regretted it, and I never will. Oh, I have one last comment here from Jack Green. Where do you think the rapidly rising political violence in the U.S. leads? Some people talk of civil war, but I don't think it would be a full-blown war, but instead a low-level troubles-like situation. So the gist here is the U.S. will keep getting violent because the U.S. is led... The U.S. right is led by a bunch of Gen Xers and Boomers. And there's nothing intrinsically wrong with either generation, but they're not very strong leaders. Gen Xers are very spiritually libertarian, and Boomers are very spiritually liberal. Even Trump himself is quite liberal when you actually look at things from an objective standpoint. And they don't like the idea that they have to use a very strong government reaction to this kind of low-level violence of assassinating top GOP political operatives, shooting police officers. I mean, the guy failed and shot a bunch of detainees, but it doesn't matter. The various other things that have happened since then, the assassination attempts on Trump himself, things like this, they don't... People like Trump, despite what everyone in, like, the left wing has tried to paint him as, he's not actually an autocrat. He's not actually fascistic. He's not actually a dictator. He's quite bombastic, but he doesn't actually have the willpower or the desire to actually be a dictator. See, in Russia, if this happened, Vladimir Putin would be, like, executing anyone remotely associated with the guy who shot Charlie Kirk. If someone randomly assassinated a key ally or a key supporter of Xi Jinping, there'd be a lot of people executed or imprisoned for life. But we're not really seeing anything. There's the shooter himself who's being tried, but as far as I've seen, no one else is. And because there's so little response from the government, you actually create an incentive to cause more political violence. The way this works is you have, at best, a disorganized group of people who are radicalizing themselves enough to carry out actions of severe political violence. At worst, there's actually people on top organizing it, and this is an organized thing, like the Troubles were in the North Ireland. Now, the Troubles in North Ireland are actually easier to resolve than what we have now, because the Troubles was a question of who should govern North Ireland. So you can actually create a deal between the Protestants and the Catholics in Northern Ireland where both are unhappy with it, but they like it more than fighting. The problem you're seeing in the US right now is you have this radicalization of the extremes who are getting more and more distant, more and more angry at each other. And this is fueled by mainstream media. This is fueled by podcasters. This is fueled by violence on either side. This is fueled by inaction. And all of these things, and oftentimes too, for example, like some of the guy who shot Charlie Kirk was fueled by erroneous beliefs about Charlie Kirk. Like things, if that is happening in your society, you have to actually act very harshly to fix it. Because if it's not fixed, it will just keep happening. If you're in a situation where one sort of loose cannon is not the correct word. One guy with a few loose screws in his head can take out a top political operative for the other side. That actually very rapidly becomes a successful political strategy. There's many times in history where just repeatedly assassinating all of the figures on the other side completely made the other side impotent. We saw this in the interwar period with the Japanese, where all of the anti-military leaders just kept getting assassinated. So then they were just turned into a very, very militaristic society because everyone who wasn't was assassinated. If you don't crack down on it, if you don't really harshly punish things like that and really crack down, go out and try to get everyone associated with it in like a concrete fashion. I don't mean like witch hunts or whatever, but like if people are talking or inciting or supporting or helping, they need to be punished quickly and publicly. And it doesn't seem to be happening in the US. So what I think is going to happen is this is only going to get worse. More people are going to get shot. More people are going to get killed. And it will just get more and more violent until either A, enough people have been assassinated that one or the other political faction is non-functional and the other one wins, or B, a government finally is elected that cracks down on it. I do not see this turning into a civil war. The reason I don't see this turning into a civil war is I don't see the political leadership and the elite backing being there. There might be people, let's say like the worst case scenario right now, that there's high-level Democrats who are tacitly supporting the assassinations. This is the worst case scenario, completely unfounded speculation, but I'm just, for sake of argument. That doesn't mean this will turn into a civil war, because the idea behind assassinations or random, quote-unquote, random shootings is to destabilize and weaken your opponent, not to cause a civil war. The goal is to cripple them so that you win politically. For this to turn into a civil war, what I would expect to happen is either... It'd be kind of like the Spanish Civil War, right? So the Spanish Civil War, the Republicans were famously doing assassinating people, putting people in prison, stuff like that. And one particular assassination, I forget the guy's name, did sort of prompt the military coup that failed. and cause a civil war. And if a civil war to happen in the U.S., I think that's the only model that would happen in 2025. It's no longer 1865. The regional identities are not strong enough that you would see mass state secessions preempting a civil war. What you would see, in my mind, is one or the other side self-coups or tries to coup the government with the backing of the military and the police state, and then the other side states seceding or forming a provisional government to fight back. In a very abstract sense, you could kind of say that the Civil War movie is notionally correct. The sides are obviously wrong. Like, the California and Texas would never side together, for example. But that's notionally correct in how that would happen. It would be one president basically self-cooing or acting like a dictator regardless of self-coup. That's kind of what would happen. But with that here, I just want to make sure I plug my poll again. It's linked in the video description. Make sure you go fill it out. But with that, I will see you guys Monday with a different video.